In late 2020, I reviewed an Asus 4K 144Hz IPS monitor that left me seriously impressed, but the only problem was that it came in at around £800 in the UK. Now AOC have got a very tempting proposition. It has the similar specs as the Asus, but it comes in at around £590, which is severely undercutting its rivals. Indeed, that is the price of the U28G2XU. Now in this review, we're going to be seeing if it's actually worth its money, and furthermore, how it actually does when it comes to competitive gaming. Now before getting into this detailed review, if you haven't already, do consider subscribing, hitting that bell notification, as it would be greatly appreciated. So jumping straight into it, let's talk about its gaming performance. And here I do have to cover AMD FreeSync and also NVIDIA G-Sync. Now I don't have an AMD graphics card, and as such I was testing it with my RTX 2080 Super. You can also see on AOC's website that it has a big X next to the G-Sync compatibility. And indeed, when I tried to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, it would refuse to run an NVIDIA G-Sync, even though I could enable the option in the NVIDIA control panel. So something to be mindful of, but if you do have an AMD graphics card, you'll be able to utilize the AMD FreeSync range, which runs from 48Hz up to 144Hz. Now moving swiftly on, we get on to HDR, and here the monitor has HDR 400 certification, which frankly is a little bit laughable. Now I wasn't left too impressed with its HDR performance, and we'll talk about peak brightness further down in this review, but what I will say is that yes, it does take an HDR signal, and if you have the appropriate setup, then you'll be able to play some HDR games. So for example, in my case, I was playing some Destiny 2 and was able to utilize the HDR signal. Is it something that I would avidly use? No. Is it something that's useful to have there? Well, yes, it's not bad to have HDR and also an HDR 400 certification. I would have potentially liked to see HDR 600, but potentially I'm asking a little bit too much from AOC, specifically given the specs of the monitor and its competitors. Now, what I was really interested about was its competitive gaming performance, and honestly, I was kind of surprised. Now, as I mentioned, it's a 4K 144Hz monitor. It has a quoted 1 millisecond response time, but truthfully that's just marketing claims. But how does it perform in terms of real world gaming? Well, I took it on to CSGO and I played around with some bots to just see how the overshoot was for starters. So here I was testing to see how the response time of the monitor was and how my eyes would be able to cope with the amount of inverse ghosting that was being shown. Now, in terms of its medium overdrive setting, there was very little inverse ghosting. While there is small amounts present and ones that will be a little bit more apparent in more graphically intense games such as Destiny 2, it's perfectly playable. If you do then dial up to the high overdrive settings, here's where certain problems occur. You can notice a little bit of inverse ghosting and therefore kind of purple trailing, and even in a potato looking game like Counter-Strike, it might throw you off. In my case, I found it playable in a game like Deathmatch, or let's say if I'm playing a little bit more serious gaming, but it's something that would really throw me off if I was playing a little bit more casual games. But thankfully, this is the competitive gaming section of the review, and therefore I can use this monitor in its highest overdrive mode. Now wait, there is also another overdrive mode, and that's boost mode. Now boost mode will reduce the overall brightness, but will also incur even more inverse ghosting. Frankly, I couldn't see myself using this monitor in its highest overdrive mode, in other words boost mode, and as a result I left it completely disabled. Now as for MBR, you can enable this in order to reduce the motion blur. It will lock the brightness depending on terms of the overall motion blur level that you go for, but it's not something that I was avidly using. So I left motion blur disabled, left its overdrive in its high setting when playing on Counter-Strike, and more importantly left the low input lag mode enabled in the OSD, which perfectly leads me on to input lag. Now the monitor's input lag is seriously impressive. While it doesn't quite compete with the Asus monitor that I was previously referencing and will be down in the description below, I do think it does go pretty much into a second spot as for a 4K gaming monitor. And as a result means that if you're going to be using this for, let's say, console gaming, or you're going to be using it for PC gaming, then the input lag that you're going to get from the monitor will leave you pretty impressed. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say in a nutshell here is that the response time is pretty good, and so is its input lag. Is it class leading? No. But is it something that you can use for playing competitive games? Yes, which is, well, a very good testament to this AOC monitor, specifically at this price point. Now, with the gaming section out of the way, let's get on to image quality. And first off, I do have to talk about its sRGB color accuracy. Now, through the OSD, you can select an sRGB mode, and here you'll find the results are very impressive. Now, put against my Datacolor Spider X Elite, I noted a 99.5% gamut coverage and 109.8% gamut volume. You'll be able to see here how it compares to the sRGB standard. But furthermore, its color accuracy is extremely impressive. At an average delta of 0.94 and a maximum of 2.13 with a tested contrast ratio of 1000 to 1, I must say I was seriously impressed by this AOC monitor's sRGB color accuracy. So therefore, this monitor can be very much used for color editing or video grading. The only issue here to note is that when you do lob it in its sRGB mode, it will limit peak brightness, and we'll touch upon this very shortly. Now, if you're a gamer, you're probably not going to want to use sRGB mode purely because of the brightness limitations that I mentioned before, and as a result I would suggest using it on terms of its warm mode. Now, warm mode does change the overall accuracy of the monitor in terms of the sRGB standard, and you can see here it has a more wide color gamut at 99.9% sRGB gamut coverage and 136.9% sRGB volume, and you can see the Adobe and DCI-P3 coverages. And in comparison to the sRGB standard, you can see it's going over the top. And this is very much reflected in terms of its sRGB color accuracy, where the average delta ramps up from 0.9 up to 2.24 and a maximum of 5.62, while contrast ratio sits and hovers around 1000 to 1. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that while in warm mode it won't be color accurate to the sRGB standard, it will still portray very vivid colors and ones that, well, gamers will appreciate. So it really depends in terms of what camp you sit in, but if you're a gamer, go on to the warm mode. If you are a color grader or a video editor of sorts, then use the sRGB mode if you want the best out of the monitor. Now, I did talk about its brightness levels, and here indeed the brightness does get affected depending on which way you use it. Now, in terms of its maximum brightness, in terms of its SDR brightness that is, it gets up to 300 nits. In sRGB mode, however, it is limited to almost half that at 160 nits. So therefore, what I was saying before really does come into fruition because, well, 160 nits is really not that bright. Now, in terms of minimum brightness, it does get down to 33 nits, which is pretty dim. And as for MBR mode, which we'll talk about very shortly, in level 1 mode, it limits it to 224 nits, whilst you have got 20 different level increments, and I didn't measure every single increment, but in terms of its maximum level 20 mode, it gets to 80 nits. And the same can be said when you run it in overdrive mode, in boost mode as well, and here you've got 80 to 82 nits as well as peak brightness, so no matter what mode you're running on. So something to be mindful about depending in terms of levels that you run. Now, you might be wondering, well, this monitor has Display HDR certification, therefore it should get up to 400 nits. Well, weirdly, I didn't get 400 nits. The maximum I got actually was 357 nits in its max brightness with an HDR signal, with an HDR image tested with my calibrator. I found this quite odd because I really feel that the monitor would have surpassed the 400 nit standard, but I just couldn't find it. Might be an issue with my monitor, maybe an issue with the calibrator or something, but ultimately I can only share my experiences, and as always, as I'm very honest as a reviewer, I have to share all the details, even if it's positive or negative. Now, on the subject of brightness, I do have to talk about brightness uniformity, which is perfectly fine with this monitor. It's not exactly a saint, but for a 4K monitor of its price point, it is perfectly acceptable. The same could be said about backlight bleed. IPS monitors are notoriously known to have backlight bleed, and this monitor is no different in this department. But still, it is acceptable, very much like the brightness uniformity, and given its price point, don't expect the world in comparison to more expensive premium 4K monitors out there on the market. So now we get onto the monitor's OSD, which frankly is quite hard to access because the buttons found underneath the monitor are a little bit hard to press and also sometimes hard to see. Nevertheless, when you do get your head around it you'll have a pretty comprehensive OSD. Now I should mention in this mode, in terms of the luminance tab, that the HDR mode, when you do enable it or you have an HDR signal, it will pick up as display HDR, or you can filter through the different HDR modes. This will also grey out other settings, so for example brightness will be completely greyed out, something you should be mindful of and not kind of worried about. As for the colour setup, I run it on warm mode, as I mentioned before in the picture quality section of this review, but if you do want to do some picture editing, I would highly suggest running it on sRGB mode. Just be mindful of the overall brightness you will get from it. Picture boost, OSD setup and the pip settings are pretty self-explanatory, and we get onto game settings, which will definitely be of interest to a lot of people. Now you don't have to run game mode in order to get the most out of the monitor, but the other things that I would very much suggest are having low input lag mode pretty much enabled permanently. And as for the overdrive modes, it really depends in terms of your game. I think most will be satisfied with medium. If you're a bit more of a hardcore gamer, you might want to go on high or boost, but just bear in mind the amount of overshoot that you will get on those modes, as I explained before. Now as for adaptive sync, it does not run simultaneously with MBR mode, so you'll have to disable it, and I did touch upon NVIDIA G-Sync not running on this monitor, at least not in with my setup. So as a result, I just have it disabled, and quite frankly in most times and most scenarios I actually leave adaptive sync completely disabled. Now as for the extras, it just gives you an indication as the refresh rate that's running and the overall resolution as well. Now with the OSD segment out of the way, I do have to reiterate how poor those buttons are. I mean, right now the monitor is in standby, and often I do switch off the monitor, but I can't switch off the monitor. The button just does not press. I'm not really sure if it's just my model or something like that, but I have previously seen AOC use such OSD buttons and they're just absolutely horrific. Elsewhere, the actual stand and the design of the monitor is pretty much flawless. While the stand does feel quite cheap and flimsy, it does provide a pretty sturdy feel, and it also does give you the full array of adjustment. You can tilt, pivot, rotate it, and also have height adjustment. And even though it's got this kind of black and red type of finish to it, I don't find it too obstructive, at least in terms of my setup. Furthermore, it has a three-sideless borderless design. It's also got some USB ports, which might be a little bit hard to access, but underneath the monitor, therefore allowing you to connect up your peripherals. And it has also got two DisplayPort inputs and also HDMI as well, so therefore you can run 4K 144Hz without any issues with your PC. Now for console gamers out there, just bear in mind this is running on HDMI 2.0. If you want to find out what resolution and refresh rate you can run with this monitor, definitely do check out my dedicated video, which is literally dedicated to will it run on my PS5 or will it run on my Xbox Series X. That video is for you, so definitely do check it out, and it will complement this video and maybe give you a little bit of information going forward when it comes to shopping around for monitors. And so this all leads me on to my verdict. What do I make about the U28G2XU? And props to AOC for actually making a name that people can remember, including myself. Now the monitor itself doesn't have the quite spectacular input lag and response time of the Asus monitor that I previously tested, but it's up there with some of the best 4K monitors on the market. Indeed, it is a monitor I would use myself for competitive gaming and also casual gaming. And not only that, it's seriously color accurate as well and has got a fully adjustable stand. Arguably its weakest point is that terrible OSD buttons in order for you to access them, and potentially its HDR certification, which sits at around HDR 400, which isn't exactly that impressive. But if you consider all of that and you think of its actual price tag, it is a monitor that I would actively recommend, and as a result it gets my Best Buy award. Now I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comment section below, and of course if you like this video, drop a like and do subscribe and hit that bell notification to see more independent detailed reviews from myself and the channel. Alright, I've been Totally Dubbed, take care of yourselves and goodbye.